welcome to the talk for tonight, the free talk for tonight. And we are really, really lucky to have a person with us who many of you know already, but you possibly don't know the sort of background military-wise for Jonny. He's already an MA degree student from Wolverhampton a few years ago. And having passed that, he decided that that wasn't good enough for him. He wanted to extend his knowledge and skills and everything else a little bit further. So he's now embarked on a PhD. So I can't really get my head around this idea of having Dr. Dyer. That sounds like somebody out of some sort of crime series or whatever. But hopefully at some point in the near future, he says optimistically for Jonny, sometime in the near future we'll have that. But that's an incredible undertaking from Jonny, and it shows his love of the subject. He's been on battlefields and been out there and doing the business in military history for 20 odd years now. And this really is a culmination of all of that work. I think the PhD's on 6 divisions on the Western Front.
That's right.
Comparative of those, which is never an easy task. 6 is quite a big undertaking. Most of the works I've seen have been 2 or 3. So 6 is quite something. But I'm looking forward to seeing that, because one of my big interests is the difference in learning, difference in how these divisions functioned and so on. And we're going to be looking at one of those divisions tonight. An interesting one in terms of not only are we in France and Flanders tonight, but we also fly over to Italy for a little while. And Jonny's going to be talking to us about the 48th South Midland Division. And just before we get going on that, remember that these free talks will be coming thick and fast over the next few weeks. So do watch social media, your emails, etc., because there are ones coming up even within the next, if I get the sort of timings right, the next week and a half, 10 days or so, a little bit less than 10 days, we'll have another free talk. So do keep looking out for them in the next few weeks. And so, to no ado now, I'll hand over to Jonny for his talk on 48th South Midland Division.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jim. 48th South Midland Division. Thankfully, Jim's done the intro, so I don't have to talk about myself, which is the bit I like least. I studied this for my MA thesis a couple of years back. It was really just an interest arising out of what an ordinary division did during the Great War. We read a lot about fabled divisions or ones who have suffered particularly bad defeats, are notorious for that. But I was interested in what actually makes it an ordinary division, how they learn, how they fight, and so on. So I looked at 48th South Midland because I've got a particular interest in the Great War in Italy, and combining a division that had fought both on the Western Front and out there, and was particularly appealing. So just a brief introduction of the picture on the front screen that you can see. That's Major General Robert Fanshawe, who was General Officer commanding the division for much of the Great War, being knighted by George V out somewhere near Albert on the 12th of July 1917. So about the division itself. But look quickly, it's quite remarkable in the sense that no one wrote about 48th South Midland Division for pretty much a century, and then in 7 years we get 2 divisional histories. One on the left by Bill Mitchinson, published in 2017, and the one on the right by Derek Plews, which came out a couple of months ago. They're quite fortunate, really. They are both very, very good accounts of what the division did in the Great War. I'm intrigued about what they say, what do they say, and what the other literature says about what role an average division plays during the conflict. Those of you who attended the Great War Group Conference in Brighton will have heard much of this before. It's been tweaked a little bit because of the introduction of a new book. It does contain considerable amounts of nerding about learning processes and SS pamphlets and all that kind of stuff. So if you come back for more, then thank you very much for doing so. If you haven't heard this before and make it to the end, then huge credit to you. It's a particular area of interest of mine, so I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to take some slight liberties with the title. The title was 1917-18 as billed on all the stuff that went out on social media. I'm just going to do a little bit on the division in 1915 and 16 to give a little bit of background to their time on the Western Front. They arrive in France in spring of 1950, and they're fairly quickly sent down to Ploegsteert, south of Ypres. Ploegsteert at that time, for much of the war, it's a fairly quiet area where new divisions are broadly set to learn about trench warfare. And they fairly quickly established themselves as a competent line-holding division. And you read through the war diaries and you see that, detachments of other new divisions are sent there to learn from them and to learn the ropes of trench warfare. What they do have in 1915, well, what they don't have more specifically, is any part in any of the major engagements at places, battles like Aubers Ridge, Festubert, Neuve-Chapelle, Ypres. They don't play any part in those at all. So they maintain a degree of continuity where the BEF, well, the divisions of the BEF that took part in those battles suffered a good degree of de-skilling and losing experienced staff officers and men. They don't have that. So there's a degree of continuity about them for 1915. There's one little anecdote from the war diaries which Bill Mitchinson picks up on, which I'm just going to talk about very briefly, just because I think it's a classically 1915 thing. In the Ploegsteert sector, the Germans build a sandbag tower, which snipers are using, and it's costing a lot in trench periscopes and the odd hapless private who doesn't keep his head down. So the division, I think it's 143 Brigade, resolves to deal with this. So they wheel a mountain gun, a nice little relic from the South African War, up to get it to almost point blank range near the sandbag tower. They flank with a couple of machine guns, and they take this tower out. Lots of sandbags flying everywhere, bits of wood, German scattering that the machine guns are turned on. All very successful. A week later, it's rebuilt. And what the note that comes down from division is basically, look, lads, we haven't really got the ammunition. Every time you fire one shell at it, the Germans fire four back. So can you just leave it alone? Very 1915, I think. A chap with a magnificent name, but Henry Ogle of the 8th Warwickshires, his quote is, "It is clear to us that we are not first-class troops. They are a line-holding division, a good, average, ordinary one at that." We move quickly to 1916 and the part that 48th South Midland Division play on the Somme. They don't actually take they're in the Goncourt sector for several months. They go there fairly early in 1916 and they're there for several months. They don't actually get chosen to take part in the main action on the 1st of July. Up in that sector, I think it's 56 1st London Division take part in the diversionary attack that takes place there. So it's probably a lucky escape as far as 48 South Midland are concerned. Two of their battalions get seconded into 11th Brigade, and they take part in the action at the Heidenkopf, the quadrilateral redoubt between Serre and Beaumont Hamel. It does not go well. It's a very typical opening day of the Somme experience. The Arras misses German machine guns that are hidden in haystacks on their left flank. It costs the two battalions that take part 20 officers and over 400 other ranks. You look through the war diaries for July and August, and they tell a pretty familiar story of the Somme campaign. The barrage is inadequate, the general inexperience of the troops, lack of familiarity with the ground, error on the part of attackers, strength of the enemy defences. If you have any kind of interest in the Great War and have read about the Somme campaign, this will all obviously be very familiar to you. But from that, division and corps are starting to see recurring themes, and we're starting to see a process of learning taking place. They're under two corps at that time. There's a memo in August of 1916 which points out things like noting the importance of attacking troops following the barrage, use of different weaponry, instructions for clearing enemy dugouts, things like the need for quick consolidation of positions taken. Now, this is all a good few months before the publication of the key tactical publications like SS135 and SS143, which I think it sort of demonstrates a sort of a bottom-up approach to learning. And with that in mind, there's an attack that's made by the 4th Berkshire Regiment on German trenches south of Thiepval on the 22nd of August, which kind of shows how the BEF is starting to shape its attacks and how it will do so going into 1917. It's an attack that's not without fault, and it doesn't achieve its objectives. But the bombardment is considerably better than it has been. And the last quote on this slide, excellent and absolutely trusted by the attacking troops, was what a battalion commander said about it. There's good cooperation between Lewis gunners and the bombing party. The communication lines are good. Royal Engineers section turn up fairly quickly afterwards and turn the captured objective into a strong point. So we're starting to see, even over the first couple of months of the Somme campaign, you're starting to see a process of learning, should we say. We move on to the spring of 1917. This is one of the most fascinating bits, I think, A, of the war, and B, of the division's journey through it. The retreat to the pursuit of the German army and its retreat to the Hindenburg Line in spring of 1917. Also, just talks about the introduction of those two key pamphlets, which really shape how the BEF moulds its attacks in 1917 and going forwards. The lessons of the Battle of the Somme are being learned. So that's the division itself. End of January 1917, they're south of the River Somme in a French sector on the right of Henry Rawlinson's Fourth Army. They've been there for a couple of days, and they get hit by a fairly substantial German trench raid on the 4th of February, which really takes them by surprise. It's a relatively quiet area, but no man's land is probably between 100 and 300 yards at this point. They get hit by a pretty heavy bombardment. Two waves of German attackers enter their trenches for the 6 Warwickshires and the 6 Gloucestershires. Both get hit pretty hard. Around about 150 casualties, including 50 dead. For a division that's been relatively, I won't say inactive, it comes as a real shock. So what do? They basically start to plan revenge for this raid. Basically the premise of this is an attack on a little hamlet called La Maisonnette, which is on high ground, the approach to Peronne and crossing the River Somme. For various reasons, the attack gets altered, it gets postponed, and doesn't actually take place until March the 17th. It meets with very little resistance, and they get patrols across the Somme, and it becomes pretty clear that the German army is getting out of town and heading back to the Hindenburg Line. And this is where you start to see a phase, which, as I've said, is not written about a great deal, where movement returns to the battlefield for a brief period of time. So what do in terms of the response to the retreat? Fanshawe is commanding 3 corps at the time, and he orders the creation of a mobile column, which is called Ward's Force, named after Brigadier General Ward, who's the commander of the Royal Artillery. It's made up, as you can see there, 2 batteries of field artillery, 2 infantry battalions from 145th Brigade, a section of Royal Engineers, and a field ambulance. And along with various mounted troops and armoured cars, they support 3 corps, cyclists and cavalry in basically pursuing the German army as it retreats. And they actually conduct 4 fairly successful operations to capture several small outpost villages on the route to the Hindenburg Line in a period of 10 days. I was just going to talk about one of those, just to give an example of what it is. Now, bearing in mind what you've seen on the Somme is trench warfare as we all know it. This is, I think, kind of a very good illustration of how things change very quickly. 26th of March 1917, they attack a village called Razelle, and I apologise, there will be various French village names butchered by me over the next 5 minutes or so, and I apologise for anyone French or who knows anyone French for mangling them. So a squadron of mounted 18th Lancers go to the ground the northwest of the village. Now, if I can get a pointer up here, I will do snazzy pointy things. So they go up here and they clear it with enemy machine guns and about 25 enemy troops. A 30-minute bombardment, after which 2 platoons each of A and B companies for the 4th Ox and Bucks actually go into the village, and they take it with support from 2 armoured cars. They dismount a Hotchkiss gun from one of the armoured cars and turn it on the retreating Germans. They consolidate the positions fairly quickly to the east, which are kind of over here. It's a very well-executed operation with few casualties. They have cavalry patrolling both flanks to all offensive counterattacks. James Edmonds, in the official history, describes it as a small but skillfully conducted operation. And this kind of continues on the theme. And the map here, I'm not going to use that pointer because it's playing havoc with my screen. Down to, you can see on the map in the sort of bottom left corner, there's Peronne. The Maisonette is just kind of southwest of there. They follow that route up east out of Peronne up towards Razelle, St Emily, Lempier and Ronsoy. I do apologise for that. It doesn't all go perfectly. There's faults in there. The 30th of March attack on the village of St Emily, basically the artillery just fails to shell the enemy front. You get instances of short shelling, which causes casualties among the troops. But the artillery, if truth be told, isn't great. As they move into April, the ground that the German army deems as a little bit more tactically important towards the Hindenburg line is far more stiffly defended, and it gets fairly ugly quite quickly. Attack on two locations, Guillemot Farm and the Knoll. And they incur fairly heavy losses for little gain. So the night of the 16th and 17th of April in dreadful conditions. It's been raining and snowing all day. Two companies of the 4th Berkshires have a 2-mile march across saturated ground in pitch darkness. By the time many of them get there, they've got fingers so frozen they can't operate their weapons. And they incur pretty heavy losses for little gain. By the time you get to the end of April, and this is a recurring theme that the division has throughout the war, it's described by one battalion commander as absurdly weak. At the end of the month, they've got only 4 of the 12 battalions have a rifle strength of over 600, one's below 400. And this is something that kind of they have a problem with throughout the war. Okay, so what do the historians say about this period for the division? As I say, the BEF actions around the retreats to the Hindenburg line are not particularly well covered or well documented. The official history covers it, but elsewhere it's treated a bit like a footnote to the Somme campaign or precursors to the Battle of Arras. Andy Locke, who many of you will know from the Great War Group, I gave him a call and said, "Look, I know you're writing about this, but what do I read?" And he said, "Well, that's the point. I haven't actually written it yet." That's pretty much the case with the retreat to the Hindenburg line. His thesis is, I'm starting to read at the moment, is very good. In terms of development of the BEF at this time, I think what there is of the historiography is not particularly fair or accurate. Cyril Falls in the official history says that the British divisions were bewildered and helpless until they became accustomed to a new form of warfare. Paddy Griffith in Battle Tactics of the Western Front, which if you don't know, is one of these key seminal texts you get waved at you when you study for the MA. He suggests that the BEF was just unable to adapt to open warfare until the 100 Days campaign of August 1918. Simon Robbins, in another one of these seminal texts of British generalship on the Western Front, he goes further and he actually references SS 156, which is a pamphlet of notes on recent operations by the General Staff of the Fourth Army. And he makes the observation that the majority of officers of NCOs have no experience of anything but trench warfare, and that they simply couldn't cope with it. What he fails to mention is later on in that report, it says it was equally remarkable how soon the troops settled down and how very efficiently most of the attacks were carried through by battalion and company commanders. So I think in the same way that when the British Army when the war ground to a halt in 1914, they didn't stop and look at trenches and not have a clue what to do. They started to adapt, and yes, it's by no means a perfect process. But the same thing happens here. They come out of the trenches. Ward's Force is a really good example of this. They start to adapt to a brief return to open warfare. And if you look at the war diaries of the time, training is largely geared towards that. So I think that the suggestion that there's this sort of degree of ignorance in the BEF as to how to deal with that is perhaps a little unfair. We move on to Flanders. The division shifts to a sector west of Ypres under Ivor Maxey's 18 Corps in July 1917. And after just over 2 years on the Western Front, it actually takes part in its first major set-piece battle of the war, in the Battle of Langemarck on the 16th of August. They attack a series of farm buildings and German strongpoints around St. Julian. So if you know Ypres, and you know the Brooding Soldier Memorial, they're up around there in August. It's described as a chastening experience, and one which I think is fairly typical of early Fifth Army attacks in the Third campaign. Their objectives are over 4,000 yards away, which on the kind of ground they're dealing with is a long way. The barrage doesn't have any great deal of effect on German first-line defences. There are lots of German machine guns that left hidden under big bits of concrete and in shell holes that don't get touched. Their counter-battery work is pretty average, as happens quite a lot in Third Eep. The tank support fails to turn up due to poor ground conditions. It just doesn't go particularly well. I think the point to note is, in terms of the divisional instructions of the attack, it's clear that they're becoming increasingly sophisticated. There's over 20 pages of divisional orders, and it covers everything from the barrage, communications, contact aircraft, liaison with neighbouring units, supply dumps. There's a model of the ground that's built near divisional HQ that officers and NCOs that are taking part are told to go and study. Robin Pryor and Trevor Wilson, in their book on Passchendaele, I think something up quite nicely they'd say about the 16th of August operation. It demonstrates how badly things can go wrong, even in the best trained and best prepared units. So they remain in the area until the end of August, when the campaign gets handed over to the command of the campaign gets handed over to Herbert Plumer. And they take part in a few small actions with varying degrees of success. We're just going to briefly look at one of those. There's an attack on two German locations up in that area. One called Mont de Hibou, which translates as My Owl, bizarrely enough, and Triangle Farm on the 19th of August. And it works quite well. The cooperation between the infantry and the tanks is well planned. The tank and infantry officers meet each other the day before and actually plan how they're going to do this. The barrage works well. They use smoke, which in particular seems to confuse the enemy considerably. Tanks, including the magnificently named Gargoyle and Gorgonzola, generally perform pretty well. And it's described by the historian of the Worcestershire Regiment as a brilliant little success. And it's a good example of a well-planned and well-executed tactical action. There is room for improvement. One of the things in the war diaries, which I found quite amusing, was pointing out that waving the shovel out of top of a tank that's 100 yards away in smoke is probably not the most ideal way to signal the infantry to advance. But we also note that in the war diaries that Speckled Jim does very well indeed. Pigeon messages came at frequent intervals and were of the utmost value to corps and division. Message received were full and gave in most cases a clear and early statement of the situation. So well done, Speckled Jim and his mates. And there we go, tank and a shovel. That I couldn't manage to animate, but you get the general idea. Move on. That's a map, unfortunately ripped from the book because it's the only one I could find. But Mont de Hibou, if you just look towards the top left of the map, Mont de Hibou and Triangle Farm are up there. So yeah, they're just, I think, kind of a little bit west of where the Brooding Soldier Memorial is, if you want to orientate yourself. So they're around there for much of August. They come out of the line for most of September, return at the end of the month, and they take part in engagements around the Brudsinger and Polkapelle battles. And this is where it starts to get muddy and starts to go wrong, in short. Varying degrees of success. The attack they made on the 4th of October actually takes both their objectives, and they deal quite well with German counterattacks. It's also where I think the division gets it. I think it's only Victoria Cross of the Great War. Private Hutt of the 7th Warwickshires gets awarded the Victoria Cross. He basically takes command of his platoon after the officers and NCOs become casualties. He captures a German strong point, takes about 50 prisoners, then retires, covers his platoon's retreat, having realised they've advanced too far. It's kind of a good example of what the British Army and the BEF is aiming for at that point. You want the man on the spot to be making decisions. You want the autonomous Tommy who doesn't panic and not know what to do when his commanding officer's been taken out. Then you get to October the 9th. Their experience about the Polkapelle sounds fairly hellish. 5 or 6 companies get lost on the march in the basically featureless ground. on the march to the starting point. It takes them 14 and a half hours to get to where they need to be through mud, hideous driving rain, and in fairly awful conditions. The tank support doesn't turn up because of that, and it just doesn't go terribly well. The war diary, the battalions, or one of the battalions in question says we were raked by machine gun fire from the outset. The barrage was lost and little progress was made. So those two actions, they take over 500 enemy prisoners. This is at the cost of 1,200 casualties. 39 questions. Fanshawe actually issues a questionnaire to his battalion commanders and asking them questions about those two actions. And it's an interesting point in the sense that the staff work seems to be generally good. There's little criticism of the planning. It's generally positive. The two things they note, the barrage just generally isn't good enough, and we simply don't have the manpower to be able to take and hold objectives. Again, it's the lack of rifle strength is one of the main problems that just keeps recurring throughout the war for 48th South Midland. So another map, so you can see they're a little bit further east this time. The Victoria cross action private hut, I think, is Tweed House, which is up sort of top centre. So that's where they are for much of the rest of Third Eep. What do the historians say? Obviously, you have to get the boss's book in there as well because it's got your name on it too. It's generally there's not much written about them, but what there is generally fair. The Mitchinson and Plu's divisional history offer a really good narrative of operations in Third Eep. There's obviously more historiography around the battle than there is for spring 1917. There's just not a lot said about the lesser divisions like them. Only Pryor and Wilson offer really any kind of critical comment or analysis. The rest is it's very much passing mentions. So I think there's scope for greater work there. We move on to Italy. This is, again, as I say at the beginning, this is one of the reasons why the division fascinated me, because you could draw a comparison between their actions on the Western Front and moving to just what, on the face of it, is a completely different arena of battle. That picture is a position called Monte Zavetto, which overlooks the Asiago Plateau, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And there were British guns based up there in the summer of 1918. Just talk a little bit about why the British end up on the Italian front. 5 British and 6 French divisions make the journey to Italy following the Italian army's collapse at the Battle of Caporetto. We should add, I think in some of the literature, there's a little bit of a sort of a saviour about the British and the French sort of riding to the Italians' aid. It was certainly a good morale boost, but we should note that the Italians actually managed to stop the Austro-Hungarian advance at the Piave River themselves before we turned up. So it's a good morale boost, and we bring good knowledge of the Western Front and tactics with us. But the Italians do deserve credit for stopping the Austro-Hungarian advance. Herbert Plumer gets given command of the IEF. This is a decision that neither he nor Haig are particularly pleased about. Haig's diary entry says, was ever an army commander and his staff sent off to another theatre in the middle of battle? Plumer to his wife is even more direct. I've just received a great shock. I've been ordered to go to Italy to assume command of the British forces there. I'm very sick about it and do not want to go in the least. So this is a popular decision all round. But as I say, Plumer in particular carries a lot of credibility with Armando Diaz, who's the new Comando Supremo of the Italian army, who replaces the madman Luigi Cadorna after the Battle of Caporetto. And Plumer stays there. He's not there for very long. He leaves in March 1918, and the 10th Earl of Cavan takes over. The Asiago Plateau, I've been fortunate enough to visit this a couple of times. It's one of the most unique battlefields I've ever been on. And the story around the Battle of Asiago is an intriguing one, which I'll attempt to fill you in on now. To give just a little bit of background, what you can see there in this, not the greatest picture, it's basically a rolling plain about 3,000 feet up. You climb up the ridge from you come out of Verona, you head north, and you basically climb up into the mountains, and you get through, and you see this sort of rolling meadow in the middle, literally in the middle of the mountains. And it's one of the two places which actually lends itself to an attack by the Austro-Hungarian army along the whole of the Italian front. The other being the Isonzo River over towards the east. It's flanked by mountains to the north, virtually the edge of the Dolomites, and then, as I say, the drop to the Venetian plain to the south. Front yard's about 8,000 yards long, and it kind of runs along the edge of that plain through the tree line. Basically, the aim of the British and French is to help the Italians stop the Austro-Hungarians breaking out of the mountains and getting down onto the Venetian plains, so they can attack the Italian forces from the rear. Neither the British or the French troops are particularly well equipped for mounted warfare, but they are men on the ground. Battle of Asiago. This takes place on the 15th and 16th of June 1918. I'm not going to attempt to provide a sort of a whole narrative of the battle, because it is one of the battles which you can describe as very confused. Communications are somewhat lacking throughout it, and that plays a part in what I'll talk about in a little while. But in terms of dispositions of where everyone was, 48th Division, as you can see, are on the left-hand side, 23rd Division on the right, and then to the right of them are the French, and to the left of 48th Division are the Italians. 48th Division, they're familiar with the area, having been there before. They've previously occupied the sector on the right where 23rd are. They've also got two temporary brigade commanders, one and 145th Brigade that are on the right-hand side, then 144th Brigade on the reserve. I think this actually makes a difference, because brigade commanders at this point in the war are becoming increasingly important in terms of planning, knowledge of the ground. So having temporary brigade commanders, I think, is possibly a bit of a disadvantage. 48th Division's front is lightly defended. We go back to the lack of manpower. They've been hit by a fairly substantial bout of flu while they're out there, and they're estimated to be kind of about 30% down on rifle strength. That's before you consider people coming back from illness and those who are probably going down with it. In terms of divisional HQ, there's two officers there. There's Fanshawe and one other, which is not particularly adequate, I would imagine. But Fanshawe has held a conference with his brigade commanders on the 14th of June. They're expecting an attack, and they're also planning an attack of their own on the 18th of June. So it's really a question of what happens first. And he believes that his men are well prepared. They understand the defensive plan, and he's generally happy with where they are. They are subsequently overtaken by events. 3 a.m. on the 15th of June, Austro-Hungarian forces open up with a fairly ferocious barrage of gas, shrapnel, and high explosives on frontline positions, supply dumps, which have been put there because obviously the British are planning their own attack, brigade and divisional HQs. There's a main ammunition dump at Handley Cross, which is kind of in the centre between 143rd and 145th, as you can see noted there. And that makes troop movements difficult and bringing reserves up because it causes huge fires. The Austro-Hungarian infantry actually break through 48th Division lines in 4 places, including the junction of 23rd Division. They mount a fairly resilient series of rearguard actions to slow the enemy advance. It does become apparent that the Austro-Hungarians have kind of wore themselves out getting to that point, but what they have is weight of numbers. It's described in the official history by James Edmonds as a battalion commanders and soldiers battle. It's worth reading the various narratives. Like I say, you can question exactly how accurate they are because they are war diaries that are written after the fact. In a battle, communications are not good. But we'll give an example. A company of 4th Oxenbucks dropped back from the front line and held their position with the help of a company from Battalion HQ under heavy machine gun fire, with clerks, cooks, orderlies, servants, and anyone else who could use a rifle. They start to mount counterattacks in the afternoon of the 15th, not with a huge amount of success, but they slow the enemy down further. by 8:15 the following morning on the 16th of June, the Austro-Hungarian army has been driven out of all of the original positions it captured. Numerous casualties inflicted upon it, and there is, according to one of the war diaries, considerable appetite to pursue the retreat. And they managed to get patrols as far north as Canove and Ambrosini, as you can see in the just to the top of the picture. After the battle, what happens? One of the accusations of levelled at Fanshawe was that he wasn't always in control of the battle, which I think is probably fair given how poor communications were. Just to give an idea, basically, telephone lines are hung in trees because you can't dig them into the rock. So you can imagine the effect that one shell has on that. You've basically lost your entire communications network very, very quickly. But his men perform pretty well, and they perform under their own initiative in many cases within the parameters of the defensive scheme. Lack of numbers, again, as I say, is a problem. After that, again, it's a process of learning. Training gets very much geared to fighting in thick woodland. And if you've read Bill Slim's book, Defeat to Victory, about fighting in Burma, he talks about getting men to fight in the jungle to get them to lose their fear of it. The training looks pretty similar. Cavan writes to the chief of the Imperial General Staff, noting that they took 1,000 prisoners along with numerous machine guns, and that the men had the time of their lives pursuing the retreating Austro-Hungarian forces. And then he sacks Fanshawe. This remains quite controversial. There's no actual written reasoning as to exactly why he's done it, and any number of people who've written on this over the years have offered various different theories. That is a whole presentation in itself. I would say that the Derek Plews book that came out a couple of months ago, he's done the most comprehensive work on Fanshawe sacking and analysing the reasoning for it. And I think he comes to a fairly decent conclusion that Cavan is being political, that basically there is command of a joint British-Italian army coming up, and he's showing his strength. He's acting decisively. Plews actually writes really well on it, and it's a clear aim of the book just to try and right the wrong of Fanshawe and the division's reputation being fairly harshly criticised. One of the additional points, which I think is always worth mentioning, James Edmonds is in correspondence with one of the battalion commanders, I think. He says off the record that Cavan was too stupid to understand what the elastic defence was. Now, given Cavan's a fairly experienced commander at that point, that's probably rather harsh, and I suspect untrue. But it's an interesting bit of background in terms of the official history and a lot of the tittle-tattle that goes on. I think Gary Sheffield notes on occasion that James Edmonds is fond of a bit of gossip. I think that's a fairly good example. Contractual obligation to mention the French on a Great War Group talk. The British official history says this: French had more men to the yard, 800 yards per battalion, as against the British 1,145, completely repelled the assault by fire alone, attacked by inferior troops who fled, even panicked after a few casualties. The Austro-Hungarian official history differs somewhat, to say the least. Yeah, the translation of the Austro-Hungarian official history is very comprehensive. It's very good. It's available online. It's having none of it. He basically suggests that Edmonds says this simply to protect the British. They were not inferior troops. It's also worth noting that fairly soon after the battle, the British start adopting French artillery techniques out there, which I think probably tells its own story. So we move to the end game on the Italian front. 48th Division don't take part in the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, possibly because of their perceived failure in June. But they stay up on the plateau, and they basically conduct a policy of raiding, patrolling, and generally harassing the Austro-Hungarians, and that continues into September and October. Resistance falls away quite dramatically in October, and the number of prisoners they're taking increases rather quickly, and it becomes fairly apparent that the Austro-Hungarians are getting out of town. So again, they set off in pursuit of a retreating army. And again, they do a pretty decent job of this. In conjunction with the Italians, they send out an advance guard, the Val d'Assa, which is, if you remember the map I've just shown you, that's on the left-hand side. They advance around about 60 kilometres over pretty hard terrain in 3 days. They capture 22,000 Austro-Hungarian prisoners, hundreds of guns, and a great deal of material. Yes, it's a beaten enemy, but there are pockets of resistance still evident. The official history notes that logistics are handled well in challenging circumstances. And I include this just because I love the picture that's taken on the front. There's your cyclist with dinner, a couple of geese that he's taking off for supper. So yes, I promise that is your basically your last cheap visual gag of the presentation. What do the historians say? The Italian front for the British is obviously it's a little bit of a sideshow. It's a relatively limited historiography, which is being improved on. What's written is actually generally pretty good. The book on the right, John Dillon's Allies, are a tiresome lot. That's based on his PhD thesis, very comprehensive about the British in Italy. George Cassars on the Forgotten Front at the top. That's out of print now. You need to dig around to find a copy of that, but it's very good on the politics and why they were sent over there in the first place. For me, there's still areas to look at. It's generally looked in the historiography as an extension to the Western Front, but I think there are differences that probably need looking at: logistics, tactics, use of weaponry. Trench mortars were adapted for use in Italy, things like that. So there's certainly more work that needs doing. So we move on, and in conclusion, 48th South Midland Division, they are a good average division which performs about par throughout the war. They don't have, like I said at the beginning, they don't have stunning successes, but they don't suffer any great defeats either. The absence of the battles of 1915 gives them a degree of continuity. They managed to retain their regional identity throughout the war. I think by the end, about 50% of casualties in Italy comes from outside their traditional catchment area. I think that they're journeying through the process of learning, however you choose to describe it, is through 1917 and 1918 is pretty clear. It's not without faults, but they fight in 3 very different environments, different types of warfare, and they handle it pretty competently. Problems: their artillery is not great. It's often found lacking, and the low rifle strength, I think, is a recurring problem. It's possibly a sign of where they are in the pecking order as not a particularly important division. The better performances that come in generally in sort of small and well-planned tactical actions. Fadshill's dismissal remain controversial. I think Derek Blues' account is really worth reading if you have an interest in it, because I think it's the most comprehensive there is. The historiography is overall, I think, pretty fair, but maybe lacking in a few areas. So on the subject of divisional histories, I think we've come quite a long way. If you want to read that, this is 40th Division, from the history of the 40th Division, which is written in about 1927, so just shy of 100 years ago. This is a paragraph at the beginning of the Battle of the Somme. Flying submarines of 60 tons apiece, capable of moving across the land 60 miles an hour and belching out destruction by death rays. People reading of the formations of 1915 will claim, what was a division anyway? So we've come a long way from that. But do we know enough about the average division? I don't think we do. That's why as Jim said, why I've gone completely mad and decided to do a PhD on the subject of studying 6 of them. William Philpott, just to round this off, William Philpott wrote an article for, I think, the Royal United Services Institute in 2009. And he said that he thinks that 80% of the divisions on the Western Front can be described as run-of-the-mill. In terms of published divisional histories, you've got an awful lot of books out there which are 100 years old. We're starting to see more now. There's a really, if you want to read a divisional history and as to how I think it should be written, Complete Orchestra of War by Peter Hodgkinson about 6th Division, which I think is an excellent book. And there are more appearing now, but I think there's a huge amount of work to be done in terms of what, after all, was the key fighting unit of the British Army during the Great War. That is that. And we move on to this slide just because I saw it, someone else use it, and I've pinched it, which I think is rather good. But I'm more than happy to listen to shorter speeches or questions or whatever you have.